Without me, she'd be homeless. My father's voice echoed through the courtroom so loudly that even the court reporter stopped typing for half a second. A few people chuckled. I didn't look up. I just kept my hands folded in my lap and stared at the worn wooden railing in front of me while the old ceiling fan turned lazily overhead. Savannah summers had a way of making every room feel sticky, even a county courthouse. Then Judge Whitmore looked directly at me. Not at my lawyer, not at my father, at me. And in a voice so calm it almost frightened me, he asked, "So they really don't know?" The room went still. My father's attorney blinked hard. "Your Honor, know what?" Judge Whitmore leaned back slowly in his chair. "Actually, she is." He stopped himself. And that was the exact moment my father's face lost all its color. But none of that happened first. No, the truth is, my life had already fallen apart long before that courtroom. And the saddest part, my own family never noticed. My name is Margaret Hayes. I'm 61 years old, divorced, retired, and until recently, the entire town of Savannah believed I was a washed-up old woman, living off her father's generosity. Truthfully, I let them believe it. By the time the lawsuit started, I'd been living quietly at the Hayes estate for almost 7 years. The house sat just outside Savannah near Isle of Hope, tucked behind giant oak trees draped in Spanish moss. It was old Southern money kind of property. Wide porches, tall windows, cracked brick paths, the sort of place people admired while driving past slowly. My father loved telling people it had been in the family for generations. That wasn't exactly true, but again, I let people believe what they wanted. Most mornings I woke before sunrise, made black coffee, and sat on the back porch listening to cicadas while the river breeze drifted through the trees. I liked the quiet. After the kind of life I'd lived, quiet became precious. 3 days a week, I volunteered at the VA clinic downtown. Most people there knew me simply as Maggie. That was enough. I helped older veterans fill out paperwork, drove a few of them to appointments, and sometimes just sat beside lonely men who needed someone willing to listen to stories nobody else had patience for anymore. Old soldiers recognize certain things in each other: discipline, silence, the habit of sitting where you can see every exit. I noticed them noticing me, but nobody asked questions. That generation understood boundaries. My father, Walter Hayes, understood none. At 82, he still carried himself like he owned every room he walked into. He'd once run a successful construction company back in the 70s and 80s when Savannah was growing fast. Back then, people respected him, or maybe feared him. Sometimes those two things look similar when you're young. My mother passed away 12 years ago, and after that, whatever softness existed in my father disappeared with her. He became harder, sharper, meaner in quiet little ways, especially toward me. My younger brother Daniel could do no wrong. Didn't matter that he was 58 years old and buried in debt from failed real estate deals. My father still introduced him proudly at church breakfasts, like he was some rising young businessman. Me? I was, Margaret said, with disappointment attached to every syllable. She never recovered after the divorce he'd whispered to neighbors. Or she lives here because family takes care of family. The truth sat right in front of him every day and he never saw it. The Sunday dinner that started everything happened in late August. Savannah heat wrapped around the house like wet wool that evening. Daniel arrived wearing loafers without socks and talking loudly into his phone about some condo development that probably didn't exist. His wife, Crystal, carried a store-bought peach pie and acted exhausted before she even sat down. I made pot roast. Nobody thanked me. That wasn't unusual. Halfway through dinner, my father dabbed his mouth with a napkin and casually announced, "I've decided to sell the property." I looked up slowly. Daniel froze mid-bite. "The taxes are getting ridiculous," my father continued. "And frankly, this place is too much house now." He glanced directly at me. "So, you'll need to make arrangements, Margaret." Crystal avoided eye contact. Daniel suddenly became fascinated with his iced tea. I set my fork down carefully. "You can't sell it." The room went silent. My father laughed once. "Excuse me, you can't sell the estate." His eyes narrowed immediately. I'd seen that look my entire life. It always appeared right before he decided someone needed humiliating. I think I know what I own. I held his stare calmly. No, you don't. Daniel finally jumped in nervously. Come on, Maggie. Don't start this tonight. But my father was already angry now. You've lived under my roof for 7 years. He snapped. Without me, you'd be living in some government apartment. I almost smiled at that. Government apartment. If only he knew. Instead, I stood quietly and gathered plates from the table. You should talk to a lawyer before trying to sell it, I said softly. That only made him angrier. The next week, he did exactly that. Within 10 days, I was officially served with eviction papers. Daniel called afterward, pretending to sound sympathetic. You know how Dad gets, he sighed over the phone. Just apologize and this all goes away. For what? A long silence. Then you always have to make things difficult. I nearly laughed. At my age, you start recognizing patterns clearly. Families create roles for each person. And once they do, they cling to those roles even when reality changes. Daniel was the golden son. I was the disappointment. Nothing, not success, sacrifice, or truth, was allowed to interrupt that story. The lawsuit spread through Savannah faster than summer thunderstorms. At the diner near Waters Avenue, people whispered when I walked in. Poor Margaret living off her father, probably mentally unstable after the divorce. I heard it all and I let them talk, because after 30 years in military intelligence, I'd learned something important. People reveal themselves fully when they think you're powerless. 2 weeks before the first hearing, I stopped by the courthouse to file paperwork with my attorney, Patricia Hale. Patricia was 73 years old, sharp as broken glass, and one of the few people in Georgia who knew the full truth about me. As we entered the courthouse lobby, an elderly bailiff looked up from his desk. The second he saw me, his posture changed instantly. Straight spine, squared shoulders. Good afternoon, ma'am, he said quietly. Not Miss Hayes, not Margaret. Ma'am. Patricia noticed my father standing across the lobby with Daniel. They noticed it too. And for the first time since the lawsuit began, I saw uncertainty flicker across my father's face, only for a second. Then his pride swallowed it whole. The first court hearing took place on a Tuesday morning in September, right after a week of heavy rain. Savannah smelled like wet pavement and magnolia trees that morning. The courthouse steps were slick, and reporters from the local paper had already gathered outside by 8. Small-town people love embarrassment almost as much as they love church, especially when the embarrassment belongs to someone else. I arrived alone in my old blue pickup truck wearing a plain gray suit I'd owned for years. No jewelry except my wedding ring, which I still wore even after Harold passed. Some habits stay with you longer than grief. Across the street, I noticed my father immediately. Walter Hayes stood near the courthouse entrance, shaking hands like he was campaigning for mayor. Daniel hovered beside him, carrying folders and coffee cups, trying too hard to look important. My father spotted me and smirked. That same expression he'd worn my entire childhood whenever he believed he was winning. Morning, Margaret, he called loudly enough for nearby reporters to hear. Hope you brought a place to stay after this. A few people laughed nervously. I kept walking. One thing military service teaches you is how to survive humiliation without reacting emotionally. If you respond to every insult, eventually your enemies control your heartbeat. Patricia Hale met me inside near the security checkpoint. She carried one leather briefcase and looked completely unimpressed by the crowd gathering around the case. You sleep at all? She asked quietly. Enough? She studied me for a moment. You still have time to end this peacefully. I almost smiled. I tried peace for 40 years. That shut the conversation down. Courtroom 3 sat on the second floor overlooking Reynolds Square. Old wood benches, faded carpet, air conditioning that barely worked. The room smelled like dust, coffee, and old paper, the kind of room where lives quietly come apart every day. As people filled the gallery seats, I noticed several older veterans scattered throughout the room. Mr. Delaney from the VA clinic, Frank Morrison, retired Marine Corps. Even Benson, who usually couldn't leave his house because of breathing problems. None of them looked directly at me, but they came. That mattered. My father's attorney was a man named Richard Coleman, mid-60s, expensive haircut, gold cufflinks, the sort of lawyer who smiled too often because he enjoyed humiliating people professionally. He approached our table before proceedings began. "Mrs. Hayes," he said pleasantly, "my client is still willing to avoid further embarrassment if you vacate voluntarily." Patricia answered before I could. "My client isn't interested." Coleman sighed dramatically. "That's unfortunate." No. What was unfortunate was that men like him spent entire careers mistaking kindness for weakness. Judge Whitmore entered exactly at 9 sharp. Everyone rose. The moment he saw my nameplate at the defense table, something changed in his expression almost too quickly to notice. Not surprise exactly. Recognition. Then it vanished. The hearing began routinely enough. Property records, residency timelines, financial statements. Coleman performed for the room constantly. My client generously allowed his emotionally struggling daughter to remain in the residence following her divorce. Emotionally struggling. Interesting phrase. Despite her inability to financially support herself independently, I stared straight ahead. Years ago, during intelligence briefings overseas, I'd sat across from men who threatened lives casually while drinking coffee. Compared to that, Richard Coleman was just noise-wearing a necktie. Still, I won't pretend it didn't hurt. There's something uniquely painful about sitting silently while strangers discuss your worth like a broken appliance, especially when your own father nods along. At one point, Coleman held up photographs of the estate. "This property has belonged to the Hayes family for decades," he announced confidently. Mr. Hayes paid taxes, maintenance costs, and utilities, while his daughter contributed essentially nothing. The judge glanced briefly toward Patricia. She didn't move, didn't object, didn't even blink. That unsettled him more than an argument would have. During recess, I stepped into the hallway near a window overlooking the square. Rain clouds hung low over Savannah, dark and heavy. A younger deputy approached quietly. "Excuse me, ma'am?" I turned. He looked nervous. "Judge Whitmore asked me to make sure you're comfortable if you need anything." I studied him carefully. Young, maybe 35, former military too. Judging by posture alone, "I'm fine," I said. He hesitated before nodding respectfully. "Yes, ma'am." Across the hallway, Daniel watched the exchange with confusion written all over his face. Good. For the first time, tiny cracks were appearing in the story they'd built about me. At lunch, Patricia and I walked to a small diner, 2 blocks from the courthouse. No reporters followed us. They preferred louder people. Patricia ordered tomato soup. I drank coffee. Finally, she asked, "You nervous about the case number? About what happens after?" That question sat heavier because she understood something important. The courtroom wasn't the painful part. Truth was, I looked out the window at passing traffic. My father built his entire identity around being the strong one. And men like him don't survive humiliation. Well, Patricia stirred her soup slowly. He made his choices. Maybe. But when you spend your whole life protecting people, even the ones who hurt you, it becomes difficult to stop. That afternoon, court resumed with testimony from Daniel. Watching my younger brother lie under oath felt strangely exhausting. "She's always depended on Dad," he claimed carefully, "emotionally and financially." I almost interrupted then. Almost because 20 years earlier, Daniel had called me crying from a casino parking lot in Biloxi after losing nearly everything gambling, and I'd wired him $40,000 before sunrise. No lectures, no humiliation, no conditions. Family protects family. At least that's what I believed back then. When Daniel finished testifying, he avoided looking at me completely. Cowardice often looks like confidence until pressure arrives. Near the end of the hearing, Judge Whitmore reviewed preliminary documents, quietly from the bench. Then suddenly he paused. A long silence filled the courtroom. He adjusted his glasses slowly while reading one particular page. Then he looked directly at me, not hostile, not curious, respectful. My father noticed it immediately. "Your Honor," Coleman prompted nervously. Whitmore closed the file. There appeared to be additional ownership records requiring verification. Coleman frowned. "We already submitted complete documentation." Apparently not. The room shifted uneasily. My father leaned toward his lawyer, whispering angrily. Judge Whitmore continued calmly. "I'm scheduling another hearing in 2 weeks." Coleman stood quickly. "With respect, Your Honor, this is a straightforward eviction matter." The judge's expression hardened instantly. "No," he said quietly. Then he glanced toward me again. "It may not be." That sentence followed us all the way out of the courthouse. Outside, reporters crowded around my father asking questions. He smiled confidently for cameras, pretending nothing had changed. But I noticed something others didn't. For the first time since filing the lawsuit, Walter Hayes looked uncertain, just uncertain enough to be afraid. The second hearing drew twice as many people. By then, Savannah had turned the whole thing into entertainment. At the grocery store, strangers stopped talking when I passed. At the diner near River Street, people whispered behind coffee cups. Even at church, I caught older women glancing at me with pity that felt heavier than judgment. Poor Margaret losing her home, suing her own father. Nobody knew the truth. And after a while, I started wondering if maybe I preferred it that way. The morning of the hearing, rain hammered the roof of the estate before sunrise. I stood on the back porch with a cup of black coffee, watching water collect along the brick paths. The oak trees swayed slowly in the wind. That house had survived hurricanes, floods, and 3 generations of bitterness. Funny thing was, the house itself had never really belonged to the Hayes family at all. At 8:30, Patricia arrived to pick me up. "You ready?" she asked gently. "No," I admitted. She nodded once. "Good means you're still human." The courthouse looked different that morning. Crowded, tense. 2 local news vans sat outside near the entrance, and reporters clustered beneath umbrellas waiting for my father to arrive. Walter loved attention. Even now, at 82 years old, he still straightened his shoulders whenever cameras appeared. Daniel stepped out behind him, wearing an expensive suit he probably couldn't afford. My father spotted me across the street and smiled coldly. That smile disappeared exactly 43 minutes later. Courtroom 3 filled early. Retired neighbors, curious strangers, veterans from the VA clinic. Even a few local attorneys came just to watch. Patricia organized paperwork calmly beside me. "You don't have to say more than necessary," she reminded me. "I know. Once this starts, there's no putting it back." That part sat heavily in my chest, because despite everything my father had done, some part of me still wanted to protect him from humiliation, which says more about me than him. Judge Whitmore entered right at 9. The room rose. He looked unusually serious that morning. Richard Coleman began aggressively trying to regain control before Patricia could speak. "Your Honor, this case has already wasted enough taxpayer time," he announced loudly. "The facts remain simple. Mr. Walter Hayes owns the property. His daughter resides there without legal standing." The judge said nothing. Coleman continued confidently. "We've provided tax records, maintenance receipts, utility bills," submitted by whom Patricia interrupted calmly. Coleman frowned by the property owner. Patricia slid a folder across the table. "That assumption appears to be incorrect." The courtroom shifted quietly. My father crossed his arms immediately. "What nonsense is this?" Patricia stood. I'd known her almost 15 years, and I'd never seen her nervous once. "Your Honor," she said evenly. The estate known as Hayes Manor was purchased in 1998 under a private defense trust registered in Virginia. Coleman laughed outright. "That's impossible." Patricia ignored him completely. "The trust's sole financial contributor and controlling beneficiary is Margaret Hayes." Silence. Not normal silence, the kind that physically changes a room. My father blinked hard. "What?" Daniel stared at me like he'd never seen me before. Coleman recovered first. This is some kind of clerical error. It is not, Patricia replied. She handed additional documents to the Bef. Judge Whitmore reviewed them carefully, and then something happened I will never forget. The old bailiff standing beside the bench glanced down at my name on the paperwork and subtly straightened his posture. Military. Instantly recognizable. Across the gallery, I noticed Frank Morrison from the VA lower his eyes quietly. A few veterans already understood exactly where this was heading. Coleman kept talking rapidly. Now, even if some trust exists, that doesn't explain. Judge Whitmore interrupted softly. It explains quite a lot. My father leaned forward angrily. Margaret doesn't have that kind of money. Nobody answered him immediately, because the truth sounded absurd if you'd spent your whole life underestimating someone. Patricia opened another folder. For 31 years, she said calmly. My client served in United States Naval Intelligence. The room froze. Daniel whispered. What? My father actually laughed once, a nervous, broken sound. That's ridiculous. Patricia continued anyway. Margaret Hayes retired with the rank of Rear Admiral. The silence afterward felt enormous. Not dramatic, not loud, just heavy. I kept my eyes on the table because suddenly everyone in the courtroom was staring at me. Not with pity anymore, with shock. Judge Whitmore looked directly toward the gallery. As some of these records remain partially classified, he said carefully, this court will not discuss operational details. Operational details? That phrase landed differently. You could feel it. My father's face had gone completely pale now. Daniel looked physically sick. Coleman tried speaking again, but stumbled over his own words. Your Honor, surely military service has nothing to do with property ownership. No, Whitmore replied quietly, but integrity does. The courtroom stayed perfectly still, and for the first time in my life, I saw my father afraid of me. Not because I'd threatened him, not because I'd yelled, but because the story he built about me was collapsing in public. Piece by piece, Patricia continued presenting financial records, trust statements, purchase agreements, wire transfers. Every document led back to me. The estate had never belonged to Walter Hayes. Not legally, not financially, not once. 26 years earlier, after my second overseas deployment, I purchased the property through a protected trust because my father's construction company was collapsing under debt. He never knew. I made sure of that. At the time, preserving his pride seemed kinder than exposing his failure, so I let him pretend. For decades, my father shook his head slowly. No, this can't be right. I finally spoke quietly. It's right. The sound of my own voice startled him more than the documents did. Walter stared at me with genuine confusion now. You bought this house? Yes. Why would you do that? That question nearly broke my heart, because he truly didn't understand. I looked at the old man sitting across the courtroom from me and remembered every Christmas my mother tried keeping peace between us. Every phone call I answered in the middle of the night, every debt quietly erased, every humiliation swallowed. Because you were my father, I said softly. His eyes filled instantly. But the hearing wasn't finished. Patricia calmly revealed more. The medical bills after my mother's cancer treatments, mine. Daniel's business bailout 15 years earlier, mine. The back taxes that saved the estate from seizure during the recession, mine. Every time disaster struck, the Hayes family invisible hands had protected them. My hands, and still somehow I became the disappointment. The room no longer looked at my father with admiration. Only discomfort, maybe shame. Judge Whitmore finally removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes tiredly. Then he looked directly at Walter. Mr. Hayes, he said quietly, I would strongly advise against continuing this action, but my father barely heard him. He just kept staring at me like a man, realizing too late that he never actually knew his own daughter. Nobody spoke to my father after the hearing ended. That was the first thing I noticed. Usually, Walter Hayes walked through Savannah like a man campaigning for office. People greeted him loudly. Men shook his hand. Women smiled politely. He fed off attention the way some people feed off whiskey. But after the courtroom revelation, the hallway outside courtroom 3 felt different. Quiet. People stepped aside as he passed. Not out of respect, out of discomfort. Daniel kept trying to speak to him, while reporters crowded near the courthouse doors. "Dad, let's just go," he whispered urgently. But Walter stood frozen near the hallway window, staring at me while I gathered paperwork beside Patricia. I could practically hear his entire understanding of his life collapsing. Finally, he walked toward me slowly. For a second, I thought he might apologize. Instead, he asked, "How long?" I looked up. "How long? What? How long were you planning to humiliate me?" The question hit harder than I expected. Even now, after everything, he still believed he was the victim. "I wasn't," I said quietly. He laughed bitterly. "You let me stand in there looking like a fool." Patricia stepped between us immediately. "You filed the lawsuit, Walter." But he barely heard her. His eyes stayed locked on me. "All these years," he muttered. "You just sat there letting people think I took care of you." "Yes." "Why?" I opened my mouth once, closed it again. Because the truthful answer sounded pathetic. Because I loved you. Instead, I said it seemed easier. His expression twisted into something between anger and shame. Then reporters rushed toward us. "Admiral Hayes. Admiral Hayes." I flinched slightly at the title. I hadn't heard it spoken publicly in years. Camera flashes lit the hallway. "Is it true you led naval intelligence operations in the Gulf? Did you receive the Distinguished Service Medal? Why did you hide your military career?" Walter stared at the reporters in total disbelief. You could see the exact moment he realized the humiliation wasn't temporary. The whole town was going to know. By evening, Savannah already did. I stopped for groceries on the drive home, and the cashier nearly dropped a carton of eggs when she recognized me. "Oh my lord," she whispered. "You're that woman from court." "That woman?" "Not poor Margaret anymore." An older man near the register slowly removed his veteran cap when he saw me. "Vietnam Navy, ma'am," he said softly. I nodded politely. "At ease, sailor." He laughed so hard he nearly cried. But not everyone reacted kindly. Daniel arrived at the estate around 7 that evening, already furious. I heard his Mercedes tearing up the gravel driveway before he even knocked. "You embarrassed Dad in front of the entire city." I stayed seated on the porch swing. "He embarrassed himself. That's not fair, and you know it." I looked at my younger brother carefully. For the first time in decades, he seemed genuinely frightened. Not of me, of losing the life he depended on. "You lied to us for years," he snapped. "No," I answered calmly. I stayed quiet. "There's a difference." Daniel paced across the porch angrily. "You made Dad look weak." That sentence explained everything. Not cruel, not unfair, weak. Because in my family, weakness was the unforgivable sin. I took a slow breath. "Did you ever once ask where your business bailout came from?" His face changed instantly. There it was, the memory. 15 years earlier, Biloxi, 3. 0 inches the morning. "You said it was an anonymous investor," he whispered. "It was, oh my God, you were about to lose everything." He sat down heavily in the porch chair. For several minutes, neither of us spoke while cicadas buzzed loudly in the humid dark. Finally, Daniel asked the question I'd secretly waited years to hear. "Why didn't you tell us?" I looked out toward the oak trees. "Because once people know what you are," I said softly, "they stop seeing who you are." That wasn't entirely true. The deeper truth was uglier. I was tired. After decades in military intelligence, after burying friends, after failed marriages and classified funerals and years spent carrying responsibilities, nobody could discuss openly. I didn't want to be Rear Admiral Margaret Hayes anymore. I just wanted to be someone's daughter. Unfortunately, my family only respected power they could see publicly. The next morning, reporters camped outside the estate gates. By afternoon, old photographs surfaced online, me in uniform beside Navy officials. Me standing near aircraft carriers. Me receiving medals at ceremonies I barely remembered. The town lost its mind. At the VA clinic, veterans who'd barely spoken to me before now stood awkwardly whenever I entered the room. I hated that. Respect based on rank always felt emptier than respect earned quietly. That afternoon, Patricia called. "You need to see this." She emailed me financial documents from Daniel's real estate company. I stared at the numbers silently. Massive debt, hidden loans, second mortgages. He was drowning again. A few hours later, Walter appeared at the estate unexpectedly alone. No reporters, no anger, just exhaustion. I found him sitting in the backyard, near the garden my mother planted 30 years ago. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then he asked quietly, "Was any of it real?" I frowned slightly. "What? You needing us?" The sadness in his voice caught me off guard, because suddenly he didn't sound like the powerful father from the courtroom anymore, just an old man terrified his life had been built on illusion. "I did need you," I answered honestly. When all the time that seemed to hurt him more than anything else, Walter rubbed his hands together slowly. "I thought after your divorce. After you came back home?" "I came back because I was tired," I interrupted gently, not broken. He stared down at the garden. "I don't understand why you'd protect us after everything." I almost told him the truth then, that soldiers get trained to protect people even when those people don't deserve it. But instead, I said, "Mom would have wanted me to." His eyes filled immediately. For the first time in my life, my father looked old. Not commanding, not intimidating, just old and deeply ashamed. But pride doesn't die quickly in men like Walter Hayes. Before leaving, he paused near the porch. "You could have ruined me years ago." "I know. Why didn't you?" "Because revenge sounds satisfying when you're hurt. Until you finally get the chance. Then all you see standing in front of you is family." "I never wanted revenge," I said quietly. "That courtroom wasn't revenge." "What was it?" I looked him directly in the eye. "The truth. The strangest thing about winning is how quiet it feels afterward. Television dramas make revenge look satisfying. Somebody gets exposed, the bad people suffer, and the hero walks away feeling powerful. Real life doesn't work that way." 3 weeks after the courtroom hearing, the town of Savannah still talked about little else. Everywhere I went, people stared. At the pharmacy, at church, at the marina downtown. Some smiled respectfully now. Others looked embarrassed, like they personally owed me an apology for believing the worst about me all those years. But none of it brought peace. If anything, the silence inside the estate felt heavier than before. One evening, I sat alone on the back porch, listening to rain tap softly against the roof while an old Navy coffee mug warmed my hands. The oak trees swayed slowly in the dark, and for the first time in years, I seriously considered leaving Savannah for good, not because of the lawsuit, because I no longer recognized my own life. By then, newspapers had published nearly everything they legally could about my military career. Local woman revealed as retired rear admiral. Secret naval career stunned Savannah courtroom. I hated every headline. People suddenly treated me differently. Strangers thanked me for my service in grocery aisles. Men who once ignored me at community meetings now shook my hand too firmly. Respect based on revelation always feels strange when you spent decades invisible. At the VA clinic, things changed. Most of all, the older veterans looked at me differently now. Not with fear, with understanding. One Thursday afternoon, Frank Morrison cornered me near the coffee machine. Frank had served 2 tours in Vietnam with the Marines and spent most days complaining about government paperwork. "You know," he muttered, "you should have told people." I smiled faintly and listened to everyone salute me for 20 years. "Better than letting your old man treat you like dirt." That landed harder than he realized. Frank leaned against the counter carefully. "Men like your father," he said quietly, "they don't know what to do with daughters who become stronger than them." I looked away because deep down I knew he was right. My father still hadn't fully recovered from the public humiliation. Walter stopped attending church breakfasts, stopped golfing, stopped meeting friends downtown for coffee. Savannah is a small enough city that shame travels faster than forgiveness. People talked, especially older men. Some secretly admired him for standing up to his daughter. Others thought he was a fool for humiliating a decorated officer publicly. But regardless of opinion, Walter Hayes became a story people whispered about, and proud men rarely survive whispers well. Daniel's situation unraveled even faster. Without realizing it, he'd spent years building his life around invisible financial safety nets I quietly provided. Once I stopped covering emergencies, overdue loans began surfacing everywhere. One Friday evening, he arrived at the estate looking exhausted. Not angry this time, broken. His expensive Mercedes was gone. Instead, he drove an old rental car with a cracked windshield. I found him standing awkwardly near the porch steps. "You busy?" he asked quietly. "Never too busy for family." The words almost made him cry. We sat outside while the evening sun disappeared behind the trees. Finally, he admitted everything. The gambling, the loans, the fake business deals, the second mortgage on his house. Listening to him felt like listening to a much younger version of my father. Pride, fear, performance, men exhausting themselves, pretending they're stronger than they are. "I thought I could fix it before anyone noticed," Daniel whispered. "That usually makes it worse." He nodded slowly. Then came the question I knew was waiting. "Did you really pay off my casino debts?" "Yes." "Why?" I stared out across the dark lawn because Mom called me crying. Daniel covered his face with both hands. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then he said something I never expected to hear from my younger brother. "I think Dad hated you because you never needed his approval." I let that sit quietly between us, because the truth was more complicated. I had needed his approval once desperately. Back when I was 23 and leaving for my first naval assignment overseas, I waited all night hoping my father would tell me he was proud of me. He never did. After a while, disappointment becomes familiar enough that you stop fighting it. 2 days later, everything changed again. Around midnight, Patricia called my cell phone. "Margaret," she said immediately, "your father's in Memorial Hospital." I stood up so quickly my coffee spilled across the kitchen counter. "What happened?" "Minor stroke. Daniel found him collapsed in a motel room." Motel room. That word hit me hard. After the lawsuit embarrassment, Walter quietly moved out of the estate rather than face me every day. Pride again. He rented a small room near Highway 80 instead. At 82 years old, alone, I drove to the hospital through pouring rain. Daniel sat outside the emergency wing looking completely shattered. He kept saying he didn't want charity, he whispered when he saw me. My chest tightened painfully because even now, after everything, my father still believed accepting love made him weak. The hospital room smelled like antiseptic and stale air conditioning. Walter looked smaller somehow, lying in that bed, older, fragile. For a moment, I didn't see the angry man from the courtroom. I saw my father teaching me how to ride a bicycle when I was 6. Time is cruel that way. Walter opened his eyes slowly when I entered, and to my surprise, tears formed immediately. "I'm sorry," he whispered. Just that. No excuses, no speeches, no pride. I sat beside the bed quietly. "You don't have to talk right now." "Yes, I do." His voice cracked badly. "All those years," he whispered, "you were protecting us." I looked down at my hands. "You were my family." Walter began crying openly then, the kind of crying older men usually spend entire lives trying to avoid. "I punished you for becoming everything I never was," he admitted weakly. That sentence broke something inside me, not because it shocked me, because it confirmed what I'd always secretly known. He reached for my hand carefully. "I was proud of you," he whispered. I just didn't know how to say it. At 61 years old, hearing those words still hurt like a child, hearing them too late. But sometimes too late is still enough to matter. Winter arrived slowly in Savannah that year. The oak trees around the estate stood bare and quiet. their branches stretching over the property like old hands reaching toward memory. For the first time in decades, the house no longer felt heavy with tension. It felt peaceful. Not perfect, but peaceful. My father came home from the hospital 3 weeks before Christmas, not to reclaim the estate, not to argue, just to recover. I converted the downstairs study into a bedroom for him because climbing stairs had become difficult after the stroke. At first, he resisted every small kindness. Proud men often do. "I can manage myself," he muttered the first morning I brought him coffee. "I know," I answered calmly, "but you don't have to anymore." That usually silenced him. Recovery changed Walter more than age ever had. Before the stroke, he moved through life like a man constantly defending territory nobody was trying to steal. Afterward, something inside him softened. Maybe fear finally reached the part pride had protected for too long. Or maybe loneliness did. Some mornings I found him sitting quietly on the back porch, watching sunlight move through the trees, just sitting, thinking. One cold January afternoon, he surprised me by asking to visit the VA clinic. "You sure?" I asked carefully. He nodded. "I owe some people an apology." I didn't ask which people. At the clinic, several older veterans recognized him immediately from the newspaper stories. The room turned awkwardly quiet for a moment. Then Frank Morrison rolled forward in his wheelchair and broke the tension himself. "Well," Frank grunted loudly, "look who finally decided to join civilized society." To my surprise, Walter laughed. A real laugh. Not sarcastic, not bitter, just human. That day mattered more than I expected, because instead of defending himself, my father listened. He listened while old veterans described losing marriages after deployments. He listened while widows explained loneliness after retirement. He listened while men his age admitted how difficult it was to apologize after spending entire lifetimes pretending strength meant silence. For once in his life, Walter Hayes stopped talking long enough to learn something. Meanwhile, Daniel slowly rebuilt his own life from the ground up. He sold the oversized house, took a regular office job, started attending Gamblers' Anonymous meetings twice a week. The first few months humbled him badly. One evening, he helped me repair broken fencing near the back pasture while the sun set over the marshlands. "I used to think success meant people envying you," he admitted quietly. And now, he hammered another nail into the fence post before answering. "Now I think peace is probably worth more." That sounded like growth. Real growth usually arrives painfully. By spring, the estate itself had begun changing too. For years, the property existed mainly as a symbol: wealth, family, pride, status. I didn't want that anymore. So, with Patricia's help, I established the Hayes Veterans Retreat, a nonprofit program offering temporary housing and support for older veterans, widows, and seniors facing financial hardship. Not luxury, just dignity. Simple rooms, warm meals, quiet safety. The first residents arrived in March. An Army widow from Mon, whose son lost her retirement savings. A retired mechanic living in his truck after medical bills destroyed him financially. An elderly Navy nurse with early Parkinson's and nowhere else to go. Watching them settle into the estate changed the atmosphere completely. For the first time, the house finally became useful instead of impressive. My father helped more than anyone expected. At first, he repaired furniture simply to stay busy. Then, he started organizing donations, fixing porch railings, and teaching younger volunteers carpentry skills. One afternoon, I caught him showing an old Marine how to plant tomatoes in my mother's garden. Both men argued the entire time. It was the happiest I'd seen him in years. The official opening ceremony happened on Veterans Day. Nothing fancy. A few folding chairs under the oak trees, coffee, homemade pies, neighbors, veterans, families. Judge Whitmore attended quietly without any public attention. Patricia came too, wearing her usual expression of permanent irritation. Even several reporters showed up. But this time, nobody came looking for scandal, only stories. Toward the end of the gathering, Daniel tapped his glass gently for attention. I think Dad wants to say something. Walter immediately looked irritated. I told you not to do that. A few people laughed softly, but then my father stood slowly from his chair, leaning slightly on a cane now. The crowd grew quiet. Walter looked at me for a long moment before speaking. My daughter spent most of her life protecting people, he said carefully, including people who didn't deserve it. I felt my chest tighten immediately. He cleared his throat. For years, I introduced Margaret as someone who needed help. He paused. The truth is, she's the strongest person I've ever known. Nobody spoke. Even the wind seemed quieter somehow. Walter looked embarrassed by his own honesty, which made it even more meaningful. Then, he added softly, and I wasted too many years being too proud to admit it. I walked over and hugged him before he could say anything else. He held on tightly. Old men who spent entire lives avoiding emotions sometimes hold hugs differently once they finally surrender to them. Later that evening, after everyone left, I sat alone on the back porch, watching sunset fade through the Spanish moss. The estate glowed softly behind me, full of voices, laughter, and life again. For the first time in many years, the house no longer carried secrets, just people healing. I thought about revenge, then about how badly I once wanted my father to finally understand what he'd done to me. And strangely enough, when that moment finally came, it didn't feel like victory. Not really. Victory would have been having a father who loved openly from the beginning, but life rarely gives us perfect endings. Sometimes it only gives us honest ones. If there's anything this story taught me, it's that the quiet people in life are often carrying the heaviest burdens. The ones overlooked at family dinners, underestimated in courtrooms, or dismissed because they don't brag about themselves. Those are often the people holding entire families together silently. So, if someone in your life loves quietly, notice them, and if pride has kept you from saying the words someone deserves to hear, don't wait as long as we did. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who still needs reconciliation while there's time. And if you believe dignity, forgiveness, and quiet strength still matter in this world, I hope you'll stay for the next